Welcome to this lesson on what hopefully is one of the least important aspects of the sentence corrections on the executive assessment, idioms. And the reason we want this to be the least impactful aspect of sentence corrections is that there are just too many of them for us to cover as part of this course. But in this lesson, we'll be talking about some specific and somewhat more frequently seen idiomatic issues that you might interact with on the test. So let's start by just recapping the question logistics for sentence corrections on the EA. Of course, we know that there are going to be somewhere between 3 to 5 sentence corrections in a 14-question verbal section. You want to assume that there's going to be 1 to 3 sentence corrections in each of the 7-question halves. And there is, of course, the least amount to read in sentence corrections as opposed to the other verbal section question formats of critical reasoning and reading comprehension. Now, strategically, this means that you want to spend about 90 seconds per question on EA sentence corrections, which is well below the 2-minute plus average that you could spend. And you want to have a pretty hard 2-minute maximum for any of these questions because generally it doesn't get easier, especially with something like idiom, if you're just trying to decide between two options and you really don't know which is right. So you do want to minimize yourself to a single reread of any sentence correction before you move to eliminate and guess to save time, remembering that you can potentially return back to the problem if you've got enough time within your pacing for a given half. Beware of listening for errors. Now, this is one lesson where I may reference listening, and that's partly because idiom are just rules of English that kind of are the way that they are. Now, we're going to focus more on meaning and intent as we do for every sentence correction issue. But here, there may be instances where just instinctively you know that, for instance, you differentiate one thing from another, not one thing to another. And why is that the case? It's just English. Instead, we want to, as always, actively and visibly look for differences indicating possible sentence correction issues, including those of idiom. So, how do we seek idiom errors? Well, first, you are going to have to kind of rely on your English instincts for just structures that immediately seem incorrect or disconcerting to you. So, you're like, again, that differentiate one thing from another as opposed to one thing to another. You just might stop in the middle of the read if you see I differentiate one thing to another, and you go, well, no, I'm not bringing them closer using the preposition to. I should be distancing them using the preposition from. You have to carefully track conjunctions in your lists and comparisons, so small words. And oftentimes, idiom is pretty closely related to parallelism issues and modifier issues. So if you track lists and comparisons and descriptive phrases, you may see idiomatic issues that are kind of related to those other common issues we see in sentence corrections. And you have to force yourself to try to avoid, quote unquote, remembering the rule in the moment. The rule is either clear to you immediately, or you may actually spend some time kind of convincing yourself of a rule that may not exist, or just misapply a rule. So if it's not immediately apparent based on your instincts for English, you don't want to sit there and go, okay, again, is it differentiate to, differentiate from? Because you're really just wasting time, probably. So strategically, as it pertains to idioms, this is also the only instance where I'm going to say you need to actually predict the fix. So you've heard me say don't predict the fix in other lessons pertaining to sentence corrections. Here, you need to be able to identify the error and predict what the correct alternative is in order to use issues of idiom in your evaluation. Again, you need to be able to look at differentiate one thing to another and go, no, that should be from, much more proactively than you might try to predict issues with other common errors on the sentence corrections. And idiom should be the final item to evaluate if you have any doubt as to what the correct answer should do to employ that correct idiom. So again, if you're looking at differentiate from and differentiate to, for example, you may go, I don't know. I just don't know. And if that's the case, you instead want to seek easier other issues that might be more definitive and objective to you. So remember to always be looking for subject verb agreement issues, verb tense issues, pronoun and article issues, because those you can actually track to the non-underline or know that a singular noun has to match a singular verb and that sort of thing. in a much more definitive way as opposed to just determining whereas versus wherefore, which is an idiom we won't even talk about in this lesson because it's just so darned obscure and you're very unlikely to see it on the exam. And of course, recognize that idiomatic differences are rarely the only issue tested on an individual EA sentence correction. So even if there is a difference of idiom between the sentences written or between some of the answer choices or among some of the answer choices, as we'll talk about here in a moment, you often will have other issues that you can evaluate as well. So again, idiom can kind of function as a little bit of a shortcut in that if you know the correct idiom, go ahead and use it. But if you don't, go and look for other issues because it's probably not a situation where the idiom difference is the only difference that you could use to determine what the correct answer should be for an EA sentence correction. So let's start just by discussing various counting idiomatic phrases and words in English. So starting with just the definition of some limited quantities, starting with a couple. So couple literally means two and only two. Few, as a technical definition, means small in number but greater than one. So technically, few could include two, but more likely you're going to see two described as a couple. And several is generally accepted as being greater than two, but less than or fewer than many. And again, we'll get to that in a moment as well, because less than many actually works here because many is an undefined quantity. We don't necessarily know how many that is. It's comparative. So again, there's some ambiguities that are going to be accepted here. But all told, we've basically got a little compound inequality that we can use here. We know that a couple is less than, but possibly equal to few, which is less than, but possibly equal to several. So just kind of ordering those for you in your mind. Now, in terms of differentiations, well, if you're going to differentiate two items, you use between. So I must decide between the two options would be an acceptable use here. But among is what you're going to use for a differentiation if you are determining among more than two items. So I can select my toppings from among the 7 condiments offered is technically correct. You would not say I can select my toppings between the 7 condiments offered because that would actually mean I'm like splitting them at the 3.5 and the third and a half condiment, and that just doesn't logically make sense. Again, we're going to rely more on like meaning reasons to eliminate here, but if you can memorize some of these rules, they may help you, especially with things like counting, which is probably the most commonly tested idiom if you're going to encounter one on the EA. Now, your countable quantities. Well, fewer is going to be in number. So you could actually differentiate 1, 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing. So you could say something such as there are fewer cats in the yard today because you can count the number of cats. So you would say fewer cats as opposed to there are less cats because, again, it's not an undefined. You'd be able to count the number of cats in the yard. You also can use many. So there are many cats in the yard today. And many is a somewhat ambiguous quantity. It just means there's a decent number. We don't know how many cats are in the yard today, but there would seem to be a significant number of cats if we said there are many cats in the yard today. And there are more cats in the yard today because more can still count the number of cats. So there are more cats in the yard today just means that there are more today than there were presumably yesterday. Now, our uncountable quantities. So less is when you're just comparing degree or something that's not countable. So the yard is less clean is the correct usage, not the yard is fewer clean because you can't count the number of clean. But less clean means it has a lesser degree of cleanliness, presumably, than it did before the cats arrived today. More, however, can be used for both countable and uncountable. Yay for the vagaries of English. So the yard is more crowded just indicates that by degree the yard is more crowded than before. Now, much also is uncountable. And you can see the yard is much dirtier, again, presumably because of the cats, but that may lead to the next question of what is the differentiation between using more or much for an uncountable quantity? And if I said the yard is more dirtier, you'd immediately probably say instinctively that just doesn't seem correct. And it isn't, because much rather than more is going to modify another comparative or superlative. So I could say the yard is much more crowded, because much would modify the more, and then the more would modify the crowded. So it's saying that it's a large increase in more. I also could say the yard is more dirty, because that would not be a superlative. I can't say the yard is much dirty. I can't say the yard is more dirtier. Again, just the rules of English, as it were, but they are relatively defined in these specific usages. So, beyond just items that can be either quantified by an actual countable number or uncountable, we may actually compare real numbers and items that are represented explicitly as numbers. Now, there are a lot of alternative structures and rules that can exist, but these are the most likely that you can apply on the EA. And even considering our earlier example with cats, I could, for instance, have said rather clumsily that the number of cats is lower today than it was yesterday. But it's more direct to say there are fewer cats today than yesterday. Now, greater is going to be an increase that is represented as a number generally. So something such as the population of California is greater than that of Canada. So population clearly could be represented as a number of people, and greater than is generally just more accepted convention, as opposed to saying the population of California is more than that of Canada. Again, the more it may be conversationally allowed, but greater than is generally preferable if you are really thinking about things that are being compared in number explicitly. Higher and lower are going to be when the compared item is economic or mathematic in its very nature. So that would be something such as the GDP of California is higher than that of Canada. And you can kind of imagine like a bar graph or a line graph where the GDP of California and Canada are being compared, and one is literally higher than the other. And that's basically how this works. Similarly, you could say Canada's GDP is lower than California's. So again, it just directly says, if you were to like look at this on a bar graph, that's kind of how you can think about higher and lower. If it could be represented on some sort of graph, then that may be acceptable. And you may be saying there seems to be a little bit of overlap between the two examples for a greater and higher slash lower. That's because there probably is. So remember that there may not be just one definitive way to write things when it comes to comparing these different countable quantities, but there are versions that are explicitly wrong, and that's the main thing you're focusing on with sentence directions on the EA. Less is going to be when you have a decrease that can be represented as a number or potentially lesser. So something such as California's area is less than that of Canada. So again, the square miles or however you want to represent that. And again, it could be represented directly as a number. Now, over under is going to be explicit in that it is compared against a defined standard, but just says basically above or below. So that's what over and under mean. So California's GDP is over $3 trillion per year. That is setting the standard, but it doesn't tell you exactly how much higher it goes. So it's that ambiguity of the exact number as opposed to direct comparison. You're just kind of comparing to a benchmark that defines over or under. So let's take a look at a sample sentence correction here. So as always, we'll read the sentence as written first. The lead to chrome ratios in yellow and green inks differs slightly. Yellow ink has a higher amount of lead to chrome than green ink does. Now, you only want to use the idiom differences as reasons to eliminate if you're 100% certain of the error and the fix, as we talked about. So we've got higher amount, we've got greater amount. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, didn't we just say those are kind of equivalent? And the answer is yes. So if the correct option isn't readily apparent to you, you want to seek another easier difference in the choices. And here you can see that between A, B, and C and D and E, we go from differs to differ. And that's going to be more clinical to evaluate because we go find the subject in the original sentence. And that was the lead to chrome ratios. And ratios is going to require the plural verb of differ and not differs. So we can eliminate A, B, and C without really considering that idiomatic difference of higher and greater. And again, the exam does like to give you irrelevant content to evaluate in the hopes that you'll waste time on it. So that's why we didn't even really evaluate the higher versus greater. It ultimately ended up being irrelevant. Now, you want to check your proper counting idioms by tracking the item or items being counted or compared, and you can use this and that as needed to simplify that. So we've got in the choice in the use of choice E, we'd have yellow ink has more than lead to chrome than green ink does. And you're going, well, it has more than lead to chrome, more than what of lead to chrome? That doesn't make any logical sense. So just focusing on the comparison, that allows us to eliminate E for an incorrect meaning, which is often how idiom needs to be evaluated. It's about meaning less than just memorizing abstract and obscure rules. Of course, read your choice back into the sentence to confirm there are no new errors or changes in meaning. So we'll read the original with choice D. The lead to chrome ratios in yellow and green inks differ slightly. The yellow ink has a higher amount of lead to chrome than green ink does. Clearly compares the amount of lead to chrome in yellow ink versus that in green ink and uses the proper subject verb pair, so we have our correct answer. Now, moving on to another somewhat common idiomatic structure or structures that you'll encounter on the EA, starting with causalities. So, because of, that indicates cause, hence the word cause that's in there. But it's an adverbial phrase and must follow an action only. So, the dog ran away because of the shrill noise is correct. Because follows ran away, and because of functions as an adverb and it's modifying the or providing the reason the dog ran away. So it's explaining the action. An incorrect usage that you might encounter on the exam would be the dog ran away due to the shrill noise. And that is actually incorrect because due to is an adjectival phrase and must follow a noun and most likely some form of the verb to be. So we could rewrite the scenario to the dog's fearful response was due to the shrill noise. And now it's correct because the dog's fearful response is the subject and it's a noun. And nouns are due to a thing. And so we've fixed that issue. Now, there's one more word that can come up with causalities, and that's since. And since is most correctly going to indicate passage of time as opposed to causality. Now, you could have a situation where you rewrite one of these sentences and say, since there was a shrill noise, the dog ran away, and people will understand what you're saying. You're basically saying that there is a causality. But a more accurate usage of since would be, since it was young, the dog has disliked shrill noise, and that's clearly articulating that there's the passage of time. That the dog has disliked shrill noise since it was young to now, presumably when it is no longer young. You could say, since it was young, the dog disliked shrill noise. That makes it sound like it's caused by being young that the dog dislikes shrill noise. Again, you could have that as a meaning, but it's not the same as the meaning articulated here, which is proper, using since to indicate passage of time. Now, conditionals, if has to introduce a condition indicating cause and effect. So this happens, then that happens, is basically the structure for if. So if we score next, we will win. And it's a hypothetical with not just two options, because we could have a score next. We could have the opposition score next. There might be no scores. So there's more than two options, and this condition will allow us to then win. So that's a proper usage of if. Whether introduces two explicit alternatives, and you don't need to say which is which because there's only yes or no ultimately in English. So I wonder whether it will rain today is a proper usage because there's either rain or not rain. If instead we said, I wonder if it will rain today, makes it sound like there's a conditional, and there really isn't a condition here. We're just wondering whether the action will occur. Whether or not, however, is going to be redundant in the prior example. You wouldn't need to say, I wonder whether or not it will rain today. Whether implies both options. Whether or not is only going to be non redundant when it's intended to introduce something that is irrelevant to the outcome. For instance, whether or not we win will make the playoffs indicates that this team, apparently our team, will make the playoffs whether or not we win today. So you're showing that the outcome of this match is irrelevant using whether or not. So let's take a look at another example involving these different conditional idioms. So, as always, we've got our example first, and we'll read the sentences written. In most cases, it is difficult to tell whether a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat. So we can see pretty apparently that there is a common conditional idiom in the answer choices. We've got whether versus if. You want to consider the intent of the original sentences written and our known idiomatic rules here to determine which is correct. And we remember that with whether, there should be two options only. If introduces a more open ended hypothetical. And you need to confirm that whichever idiom you choose actually creates or maintains a complete sentence. So if we switch to an if, we actually will end up with a fragment here. So we think in most cases, it is difficult to tell if a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat. That makes it sound like we're just describing the basketry fragment, and that basketry fragment has to have some sort of condition attached, specific individual condition, as opposed to like two options, and then it has to lead to some other hypothetical, and it doesn't. So the ifs would actually create fragments here. So we can eliminate C, D, and E. A, if we recognize that there are two options, it should be whether out at the outset, or by actually reading the sentence with one of the ifs and going, actually, that creates a fragment because I need to have a hypothetical afterwards and a condition that comes as a result of it. So then we take our remaining options and we'll have to determine if either of them changes the meaning or introduces a new error. And if we look at choice B, we got in most cases, it can be difficult to tell whether. And in the original, it said it is difficult. So changing from is to can makes a new meaning for the sentence and allows us to eliminate B and read the sentence as written just to confirm that everything is correct and that it is, in fact, a complete sentence. In most cases, it is difficult to tell whether a basketry fragment derived, and that's the action here if whether is used properly, because whether it derived from this or that, and the fragment's derivation is the action. And so our correct answer is A. So then we've got what are known as additive structures. So these are basically kind of like little miniature lists. Now, both is the most simple additive. And it's used to simply combine two items of equal stature within a sentence. And the only thing that you can use as a conjunction for both is and. So you'd have, I did both this and that. You won't say both this as well as that. And that misuse of as well as can be something tested on the exam. So you want to make sure that if you see a both, it's just a both this and that, such as Harshita was both hungry and tired. Simple enough, makes complete sense. She was both hungry, which is one feeling, and tired, another feeling. Absolutely fine to say that, and we're just saying they're kind of equivalent. Now, you also can have a structure of not only but also. And this is used to present two items, the second of which is somewhat surprising. So the items have to be parallel both conceptually and grammatically. And this is true for both as well, but it's probably a little bit more likely to be tested in a not only but also construction. So we could have the sentence, Harshita was not only hungry, but also tired. And that's fine, but it articulates a slightly different meaning than the first instance. We're saying that not only was she hungry, but also she was tired. And that tiredness may seem a little bit like, surprising or unexpected, as opposed to just saying she was hungry and tired, and it just sounds like it was the end of a long day. Now that as well as. So, as well as is in meaning similar to the not only but also construction, but it's important to note it doesn't create a compound or plural subject. So we could write a sentence such as Harshita, comma, as well as John was late. So that's saying that these two individuals were late. But when we're talking about Harshita, she remains the single subject of the verb was. So I would not say Harshita as well as John were late because we're separating the two. And we're just saying that John had the same outcome as Harshita at that moment. Now, let's go take a look at one more example here. And so we'll start by reading the sentence, and you can see that there's already a pretty apparent additive structure. So I'm going to read the names just because I figure I should try to pronounce them. But remember, on the EA, you may decide to just kind of what we call black box these names and turn Danangang Kalanduyan into DK and make it simpler for yourself, because I don't need to spend the time to properly pronounce it in my head. But starting from the beginning, Danangang Kalanduyan, director of the Palabunian Kulintang Ensemble, not only trains Filipino Americans in the art of Kulintang music, but performs internationally as well as, like Samang Sam, is an ethnomusicologist by training. Now, there were a couple of things that got a little bit clunky towards the end, but we can just focus first on this not only but structure. And so we bring in the answer choices, and we want to determine if we could fix that not only but structure that we may recognize as being incorrect. And we can see that there are some but also options. And since we were able to predict what that correct idiom should be in the choices, we can eliminate choice A and B immediately for not having that also that is required by the structure. Then you can consider the other structures using this and that to test your proper idiom. So the as well as here at the end of the underline, we've got but performs internationally as well as, like Samang Sam. We don't want to say as well as and like. He either does this as well as that person, Samang Sam, or he does it like Samang Sam. So we don't want the redundancy. So we can eliminate choice D. And we have to remember that we've got to consider the meaning with these idioms. So if we look at choice C, we've got along with, like Samang Sam, and that's not correct either. So we can eliminate C along with D, A, and B at this point. And we just have to read our choice back into the sentence to confirm no new errors or changes in meaning. And so, Danangan Kalanduyan, director of the Palabunian Kulintang Ensemble, not only trains Filipino Americans in the art of Kulintang music, but also performs internationally and, like Samang Sam, so saying that he's like this person, is an ethnomusicologist by training. And the two items that are linked by the and are performs and is. Those are both verbs, so this is parallel, and we can select choice E at that moment. So now, let's take a look at our idiom evaluation checklist. First, carefully read these sentences as written, noting any immediately erroneous idioms and eliminating any choices repeating that error. Then you have to go look for your fix. That's the big difference here with idiom. I got to proactively seek the correct idiom or idiomatic structure in the choices. And if the predicted correct idiom is in the choices, pick it, choose it. That's right. But if it's not, you want to go look for a different issue. Look for subject-verb agreement, modifiers, parallel structures that you can address without idiom, meaning comparisons, lists, pronouns and articles, verb tenses. And of course, always read your choice back into the sentence to ensure that it logically captures the intent of the original without introducing any new changes or errors in that new structure. So let's move on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more idioms that we didn't even discuss in this lesson because, unfortunately, there are so many idioms and not enough time to get to them, and you really don't need to get all of the idioms correct to excel on the EA. So let's hop on over to the whiteboard and take a look at how we can adjudicate even some of the idioms we didn't talk about if you encounter them on the test. So here we have a sample sentence correction, and we're going to set up the scratch work as we do every time. We got A through E with a little line over top for a possible issue if we identify it in the sentence as written. So starting by reading, pipe making is a recognized art with skilled pipe makers using carefully selected materials, and they are considered to be among the most special objects used in North America. And you may be thinking to yourself, hey, there's that among. We were just talking about among versus between. Maybe that's an issue in the choices. But if we scan the choices, we discover there's no between. And this is a common tactic of the exam to put little idiomatic differences that you tend to fixate on and ignore more meaningful differences that create clear errors in the intent of the sentence as originally presented. Because if we look at the beginning of this underline, we see a they. And we know that for all pronouns, we have to go find the clear, unambiguous reference. So they is a plural third person pronoun. So we need to find a plural subject for this they, which are considered among the most special objects used in North America. And if we go before the they, we find materials, and we've got pipe makers. Now, the materials are used to make the pipes. They themselves are not the most special objects used in North America, or among the most special objects. And of course, the pipe makers, we shouldn't call them objects either. So we've found an ambiguous pronoun in the idiom lesson. So we'll eliminate choices A and B for those erroneous theys before we even begin talking about a more subtle idiomatic issue that exists in the sentence as it's presented. Now, we then look at the remaining answer choices, and the differences are basically the shortness to a degree. So we've got very close to the original. Pipes are considered to be among in choice D. We've got pipes are considered among and pipes considered. So we know that the exam does generally prefer concision. So if we consider choice E first, we've got, and pipes considered the most special objects used in North America. Well, that changes the meaning markedly and suddenly requires the pipes to have some sort of verb for that secondary subject. So E changes the meaning because now pipes are the most special objects, or some subset of pipes, and are no longer just considered among the most special objects. So this changes the meaning definitively from what was originally intended. And we can eliminate choice E, even though it is the shortest option. But then when you're considering more obscure idiom, you often will be well positioned if you just consider, do I need the extra words? And generally, the default on the exam is to omit or delete. So we've got considered to be among versus considered among. And this, again, is one of those obscure idiom rules in English that we didn't even discuss in the lesson, but considered doesn't require any preposition after it. And in fact, the source material that I got this sentence from actually used the considered to be incorrectly. And that is just a common misuse. And the way that it's more easily adjudicated, even if you didn't know before that considered doesn't need a preposition following it, you could just say, does the to be add anything to this sentence? Because that allows us to potentially even eliminate D for being redundant, even though it is also an idiomatic error. And idiom, as we talked about, is kind of like that shortcut cheat code. If you know that considered requires no preposition, you'll probably get to C pretty quickly. But as always, read the sentence with your choice before selecting to confirm that it doesn't introduce any errors or confusion or change the meaning in any way. So pipe making is a recognized art with skilled pipe makers using carefully selected materials. And pipes are considered among the most special objects used in North America. Everything makes sense. It captures a logical meaning and is our correct answer. So if we scroll on down, we'll take a look at one more sample sentence correction here. So setting up the Scratchpad, as always, we got A, B, C, D, E, once again with our little line over top. And so reading this at the outset, we've got any person who is neither party to the 5-year reviews or an interested party may submit a brief written statement pertinent to the reviews by May. So we do have a relatively clear idiomatic two-part structure of neither and or. And if you're going to look at any two-part structure, not only will we need to consider any idiomatic issues, we also have to make sure that it's parallel. And idiom and parallelism, comparisons, lists, and even modifiers are often very closely related. So let's break this down. And so we're going to have our introductory word of neither. And that leads to part one of the list. So we've got party to the reviews. And we'll leave out the 5-year reviews. That's just a descriptive term that doesn't really affect the list all that much. And then we've got the part that probably is already jumping out as incorrect, an or. And that or leads to part two, which is our non-underlined portion, which is an interested party. So Right now, you've probably already established that we don't need neither or. It should be neither nor. So that allows us to eliminate choice A, choice C. And if we look at choice E, we switch to either. Well, if it's either, that means that it's acceptable. Neither means that it's not. So E is out literally for changing the meaning. Then we get to potentially the hardest part because we've got either neither a party to the 5 year reviews nor versus neither party without the A. So we have to decide whether or not we need that A. And we have to always use the non underlined portion to inform that. And we see that we've got an and after our underline. And so we do need the article before the party in the underlined portion to remain parallel. And that allows us to eliminate choice B. And as always, we read the sentence with our choice to confirm it captures the intended meaning. Any person who is neither a party to the 5 year reviews nor an interested party may submit a brief written statement pertinent to the reviews by May that captures the intent of the original, uses the proper idiom, and changes it to neither a this nor an or a that as a proper parallel structure. So D is our correct answer here. Go ahead and practice your own set of idiom questions to improve on some of these idioms. But remember, also always look for our other issues when thinking about sentence corrections in the verbal section.